Cheryl Toomey is back. Okay, let's see. Another commenter asked this question, but I'll take it a step further. Have you found Christ, and if so, how? I'd really like to know. It sounds like your journey paralleled mine. If this is too personal, I completely understand, my friend. It's not too personal. Somebody wrote something about a post that we did before Christmas, and I almost responded to this because I've had this issue before, and I thought I had nipped it in the bud, but I didn't. So let's go to what I'm sure prompted that question. Assuming that eventually we'll scroll my page up. We've had somebody on staff that's been doing our own memes, basically been pulling quotes of mine and so on. And I told them, pull quotes of mine and pictures of mine, put them together. It'd be great. Get some things out there because they share very well. And so I was in Florida, and just before Christmas, I come back and I see... Come on. I'm working on it, folks. It's here somewhere. This is another part of the Stratosphere Lounge experience, is sitting there waiting while the host does something off camera. Where is it? All right. It's here. Hang on. Unless it's been taken down. I didn't take it down because I think sometimes you just... sometimes you just keep throwing fuel on the fire, just let it go. I'm going to answer your question, Cheryl, by the way. One more scroll, because I got to get the wording right. Where is it? Okay, I'm going to find it because now I have to find it. It's important that I find it. Because it's just relevant, and I just I wanted to get this sort of addressed anyway. I don't see it. Which is odd. Maybe I don't see it. In any event, there was a Christmas message that was posted by an employee here, and it basically said something to the effect of, Merry Christmas, and everybody, may we never lose our faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior, something like that. Thank you, Bill. And that's not my language, and I didn't put it out there. Now, the reason I bring that up in response to your question is that a lot of people said, wow, we've seen this amazing journey of yours over all this time. It has been an amazing journey of mine, but that is not my landing pad. I didn't write that. And I'm quite upset that it appeared, because I have made it very clear many times in the past that nothing, after having several of these things blow up in my face, that from now on I don't want any words that are not my words. Period. It's right above Snoopy. Why is it? It's blacked out for me. I'm looking. I do not see it. In any event, oh, there it is. There it is. I was looking for a picture. Here's what was posted. It's my picture there, but it says published by Gavorg, the staff person in question. Merry Christmas from the Bill Whittle team. May our faith in the Almighty Jesus Christ never waver. I didn't say that. And I wouldn't say that. And the reason I wouldn't say that is because this is not about, it's not what I do here. It's hard enough to keep this conservative boat floating. And you don't have to believe in you don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to be a believer, you don't have to be any of those things. I was quite upset at seeing that. That was not my statement. But then again, if I come up and say, hey, sorry about that, once again, people say, so you don't control the content on your own Facebook page? And once again, I have to say, well, apparently I don't. No, apparently not. That was from the Bill Whittle team, and it had Gevorg's name on there, but his name is in light gray and small letters, and my name is in big blue letters, and my picture's there. So, needless to say, that was taking some liberty with me. So, where does that leave me? Well, it's I won't say it's complicated, but it bears an explanation. As most of you have been watching the show for a long time know, that for most of my life, certainly my 20s and 30s, once I became about 13, 14 years old and started getting into astronomy, and I found out about amino acids in the Carl Sagan experiment. You take the hydrogen, helium, methane, and ammonia of Jupiter or Saturn or whatever, you shoot an electric spark through it, and it creates amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of life, and so on. Sort of this very mechanical explanation of how life came along and evolved. I've grown quite a bit since then, but no ground that I've trod since then negates that. I think the scientific evidence for evolution is overwhelming, just absolutely overwhelming, and that. And not just overwhelming in terms of just the biological evidence, but the time evidence, and you can't really get away from the whole new Earth, old Earth thing, and the continental drift, and the expansion of the universe, redshift. All this stuff says that no, it's a pretty old place, and all this stuff has had time to do what it was going to do. So I never had a moment where I said, gee, everything I believed about the kind of scientific, mechanical mechanisms of life on Earth wasn't true. I never had that moment. I still think it's true. I think it's 100% true. But in the same way that Einstein's theory of relativity covers velocities and gravitational fields and things that are well outside of the perception, let alone the mental framework of Isaac Newton. So you have Newtonian ideas of orbits and so on, and they're profoundly good. And using Newton's theories of gravitation and his formulas and so on, you can get remarkably accurate predictions of what planets are going to do and so on. But we live on planets, and planets are things that we can see in the sky at nighttime. We have eyes to perceive planets, and when you get down to it, the perception of planets as billiard balls moving through the ether is extraordinarily good way to describe what we're seeing, but at the margins, it started to break down. Minor observations about things were starting to break down, and stuff that Newton couldn't explain were happening. Newton saw the planets move. He along with Kepler and Copernicus and all the rest, and Tycho Brahe's observations, all the rest of it. So Newton had this picture of the world, and Einstein came in with a theory that was considerably bigger than Newton's theory, much bigger, covered lots of ground outside the boundaries of what Newtonian physics covered. But the critical thing here, and this is absolutely essential, is that nothing in relativity contradicted Newtonian physics. It enlarged on it, and it took physics and took our view of how the world is built, how the universe is built, into places far beyond what Newton imagined. But even under relativity, objects the size of planets moving at the velocities that they move behave exactly the way that Isaac Newton said that they do. And I'm not aware that they say Newton discovered gravity. He became aware of the phenomenon of gravity, And he was certainly key in understanding that this force that nobody could explain, and we still have a very hard time explaining, was responsible for keeping these objects that were formerly traveling in a straight line into a curved line and not accelerating, not decelerating, not being acted on by external forces, so on, so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. But Einstein comes along, he has a bigger view of the world than Newton did. But it doesn't contradict what Newton did. It doesn't just say, no, you're wrong, throw it out. It just says, you're right within these narrow circumstances. But when you get into wider circumstances, your theory doesn't cover what mine does. And they're still looking for a theory that's going to basically do for Einstein what Einstein did to Newton. So I know this is a roundabout answer to your question, but since you asked, deserve an honest answer. That aspect of the whole thing, I still believe in completely, and I believe it because I think there's overwhelming evidence for it. And if there wasn't, or overwhelming evidence to the contrary, I would change my mind. But it occurred to me probably about 2008 or 9 or so that there was an incredible amount of arrogance built into the atheistic position, which I'm trying to be as fair as I can here since I was part of this for 30 years, that because you do not need an explanation, let me rephrase that, because you do not need a supernatural explanation for how we got here, therefore, there is no God because he's not necessary. That argument made sense to me for a long time, and now not so much, and I'll tell you why. Because of two scientific truths. This is what I'm about to do. The philosophy behind what I'm about to tell you is debatable, but what I'm about to tell you is experimentally proven as anything in the world. The two things that really got my attention are, number one, how limited our perception is. We see a very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's wavelengths longer than we can see in terms of infrared, microwaves, radio waves, and shorter than we can see, cosmic rays, X-rays, and ultraviolet, and all the rest. So we are seeing only a very narrow part of light. And there are entire things that we're completely unaware of. Radio signals that are passing right through my body at this exact instant, and yours as well. Neutrinos and cosmic rays coming in from above. Neutrinos coming in from below. Wherever the sun is for you, we're recording this at nighttime, so the sun is below the Earth somewhere, down there somewhere. And neutrinos from the sun, coming out of the core of the sun, have just left the sun 8 minutes ago, and have just gone tricking through space, and they've just gone right through me and right out the other door. Now, we learned that through science, and we learned that through an enormous amount of hard work and perseverance, and I'm very proud of that in terms of being a human. But what it showed me philosophically was that the universe is far more complex. It's not only, it's that old line, right? The universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. There is so much that we do not see, which is to great credit for the achievements that we've done. We've done miracles with these little cantaloupe-sized pots of gray jelly up here. But there is so much that we do not perceive, and the idea of extra dimensions, which seems to be certainly true and certainly mathematically true, time without question strikes me and most people as a dimension of space that we are moving through at a constant rate, and that we simply are not able to perceive our motion through it. In the same way that a flatlander on a table that's moving up into the sky on a construction crane, let's say, has no way of knowing that he's moving through the third dimension because he's limited to the first two dimensions. One of the things, I don't know if this was somebody else gave this to me or whether I came up with it on my own, doesn't really matter, I guess. But if you look at something tangible like this mug, we would all agree that this is a three-dimensional object, right? That it has height, it has depth, and it has width. But it's not a three-dimensional object. This is not a three-dimensional object. It's a four-dimensional object. And it has 4 dimensions. And the 4 dimensions are: it has height, it has depth, it has width, and it has duration. It has duration. It remains here. We never think of that because that 4th dimensional journey that we're all making together at the rate of 1 second a second down the line of the 4th dimension is so built into everything that we do that we don't even realize that this is a 4-dimensional object, at least 4 dimensions. So when you start to get into these weeds, you begin to realize that you begin to realize that by claiming you basically know all of the answers, you're a person who has a map of Texas, and maybe you have a very good map of Texas. Maybe you've got Google Earth of Texas, and you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, and you can see where every little car is parked and every single thing, and you've got so much information that you say, no, I understand Texas. When in point of fact, you don't understand Texas at all. You have a boundary on a map, you have lines on a map, and you can zoom in and you can look at parts of Texas. But you simply can't conceive of the amount of grains of sand in a square foot of Texas, let alone all of Texas, that you have basically made the map the territory. And you have assumed that because you have a good understanding of the map, you do not realize how many hundreds of orders of magnitude a map is reducing reality. The reality of Texas is that somewhere out in the middle of that map of yours, smaller than the resolution of Google Earth, is a pebble, and underneath that pebble right now is a beetle, and on the feet of that beetle are bacteria, and those bacteria are made up of atoms and molecules and so on. And that's all part of Texas, and you don't see it. You just don't. You say, Texas is what Texas looks like. There's Texas. I understand Texas. I have a map of Texas. I know where everything is in Texas. Therefore, ask me anything you want to know about Texas, and I can tell you. And there are people probably can tell you everything that you could ever ask about Texas. They can tell you when it was formed. They can tell you the geographical history of it. They can talk about the plate tectonics behind it and so on. But not one of them can tell you anything about the fact that there are atoms making up a molecule that make up a part of a bacteria that's on the foot of a beetle underneath a pebble in Texas, and that this is going all the way out and down. The universe is so much more complex than we take it to be, and the only reason that we can understand it at all is because it follows rules. The universe follows rules. There's their laws. And once you understand the laws, then, okay, you begin to be able to make predictive things. So that was one part of it. And the second part of it was this. When you get into quantum theory and you see what experiments are done, and it's not just experiments. None of us would have cell phones without this technology. It's all very clearly understood. At least, let me rephrase that. It's not understood. Even the people who are the most capable of understanding it, the people working in quantum mechanics right now, brilliant minds, brilliant human minds, don't understand it. In the same way that nobody understands what Texas is. They don't understand it. They are working towards an extraordinarily simplified description of external reality, which does exist. It's a description that can be compressed into, and I mean really compressed into, the limited perception, sensory perception, and processing perception abilities of these primates here on this planet. And people think that's a criticism. It's not. It's a miracle. I am unbelievably proud of what the species accomplishes, but it is so much of a reduction of what's really there. So what happens when you get into quantum theory, and you get down to this very, very small microscopic level, is things don't behave the way you think that they behave. They behave in very strange ways. And this is mathematically proven, scientifically proven, experimentally proven, repeatedly for the same mathematical values again and again and again. And there are quandaries. And one quandary is that if we look at a particle, we can tell you its position, or we can tell you its speed, but we can't tell you both. It's not like we don't have a good enough microscope. It's just by measuring one, you lock out the other. We can't process that. We can work with it, we can use it, but we can't really process it. We can't really know it in the way we think we know it. We know, for example, that with quantum entanglement, if we take a look at one particle and we determine its charge, then the other particle will instantly take the other charge, even if it's on the far side of the universe. It's faster than the speed of light, it's instantaneous. So when we make an observation here, something on the far side of the universe over there changes instantly, and it only changes because we made the observation. Before making the observation, it was in a state of yes and no, both. It was in a state of quantum uncertainty. We've done experiments that show that light behaves like a particle or a wave, depending on whether or not somebody's looking at it. And so what the evidence is overwhelmingly for is that observing the universe, just observing it, not touching it, just looking at it, changes it. And it changes it because it forces all of these quantum uncertainties to compress themselves into reality. The fact that you're calling it out. You're basically saying, hey, you don't get to be in both states. I'm coming through this door now. You're going to have to decide whether the cat's alive or dead. Yes, I understand it's both until I open the door and look at it, but I'm coming through the door, so make a decision, reality. And reality does. There is a theory that says that the universe has in fact become more complex as we become more complex observers. In other words, if humans are the only observers out there, and I'm starting to believe that we are, although that's a question for a different day, I'd like to get that question again. That if humans weren't here, then the universe would in fact essentially be a sphere with little sparkles in it. Now that sounds completely counterintuitive, but this is my point. See, there's a lot about quantum that's counterintuitive. But let's just stick with the stuff that we know. We know that the universe is expanding. We have superb evidence of a Big Bang that occurred 14.5 billion years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. And given the genius of humanity, we're able to tell you what happened all the way back to the first 100,000th, maybe the first millionth of a second after the Big Bang. We can describe all of that. How all of these different forces unfolded, how it expanded and cooled. There's echo of it is still out there. You look at the universe with radio telescopes and you can actually see the background radiation of the explosion. You can actually hear the echoes of the boom. And we all know that basically the universe, think about this, started as an infinitely dense, infinitely small point that simply exploded. And that's a mind blower, but the one that's even more of a mind blower is this. We can comprehend around that. We can comprehend around it because we've seen things explode. And so we say, okay, so the universe is kind of like just a really huge firecracker that was compressed into a very small space, smaller than we can imagine, and was unbelievably hot, hotter than we can imagine. But we know the sun's hot, and so we can kind of get around the boom. But what we can't get around, ever, and I don't care who you are, I don't care if you're a cosmologist, you can work with it, but you will never understand this. The universe is expanding out into a bubble, and space is increasing. Everything is getting further away from everything else, but that's not the part that's inconceivable. The part that's inconceivable is, what's it expanding into? In other words, if this is an expanding bubble, that's creation, and all of the universe and all of the dimensions are inside this bubble, and the bubble's getting bigger, all of this we know to be as certain a fact as we know just about anything. What's on the other side of the bubble? What is it expanding into? And the answer is nothing. And this is where you hit the wall. This is where you simply stop. What do you mean nothing? Nothing. So it's like a vacuum? No. Well, is it a featureless white void? No. Well, there's something on the other side of this boundary. No. When you say there's nothing on the other side of this boundary, you mean that there's a huger, emptier space that no. There's nothing. And we can't get there. And I don't care who you are, you can't get there. These brains, even Einstein's brains, cannot understand infinity or eternity. We can understand enough of it to work with it, but we will never, ever understand what it is. We won't. So, these things together have led me to a scientific conclusion, which for me is a scientific conclusion. If our perception is as small as we know it to be, if we see so little of the world as it really is, but just see these reflections on a cave wall, and if our perception of things is orders of magnitude reduced so that we can say we know where Texas is when in point of fact we don't know anything about the actual reality of what we describe as Texas. And finally, if you add to that the clear evidence for observing something changes something. It changes the structure of the universe to look at it, to think about it, changes it. All of these things are true, and I don't think there's a so-called scientific humanist out there who would deny any of these things as being scientifically true. I think they're well proven, all three of them. But where I go with this philosophically is, if this monkey brain here, which is capable of tremendous things, but if this monkey brain is capable of changing the universe by observing it, and in some cases just looking out the window, in other cases looking down on very, very small levels with very, very precise instruments. But if we accept that, and it's true, then you have to be prepared to say that this human intellect is the greatest intellect that's ever existed or that can exist. And the reason I say that is because we change the universe to the degree that we observe it, but as we've already agreed, I think, we observe such a very, very small fraction of it. We look at the world through a cocktail straw. So if we're able to change what's inside the cocktail straw, if we're able to change what we can perceive by observing it, then who's to say that a larger intelligence, perceiving much more than we do, isn't able to make far greater changes than we can imagine? And if the intellect and if the source is, if there is a bigger brain than ours, and I don't think that's too much to ask of people to assume that there are people or creatures, maybe they're not supernatural creatures, but smarter than us, then you can reach a conclusion that says that the universe didn't exist. Observers didn't exist because the universe allowed them to exist. When you get to this level, you can say, no, the universe existed because of the observation, and that the structure of the universe is information. And you can say this because it's the act of observing that compresses the quantum probabilities. So scientifically, I got to a place where I have come to believe that it's certainly not impossible by any means that everything that we experience in this world is the result of a mind, and not just a mind, a presence that is capable of simply thinking things into existence, because we can think little things into existence. We can do it kind of, particle by particle with this. So it's possible that somebody could think something into existence, speak it into existence. It is uniquely interesting that that the book of Genesis begins with, in the beginning there was darkness and the void, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. That's pretty much exactly what happened. This is where I don't think this is a coincidence. I don't think it can be a coincidence, really. I know there are a bunch of different creation myths and so on, but this one nailed it. It's exactly precisely what happened. There was void and darkness, and then suddenly there was light. And once there was light, everything else followed. So I don't think that we parameciums in our little petri dish, who are happily chewing down on the beef broth, the little bacteria that we are with our little bacteria intellects, are chewing down on this food source, and we're happy as we can be. The bacteria that are growing in a petri dish in a lab don't know that they're in a lab, and they don't know that they're in a petri dish. They're bacteria, and they are having as much of a bacteria time as the actual bacteria out there in the other world. They don't know they're in this structure. They don't know they're in a laboratory. They don't know they're being observed. None of it. It goes right past them. And we're more advanced than bacteria, but I'm not so egomaniacal to think that I am therefore the end result of evolution, although I often do believe that. So where does that leave you? Well, if you're dealing with bacteria in a petri dish, there is a being that has complete control over the life and death of all of those bacteria. You continue to feed it, and they'll grow and grow and grow, or they can kill it with poison or irradiate it or whatever they need to do with it, burn it, and fry it to a crisp. And it's at the mercy of that creature, that supernatural creature that controls everything inside that petri dish. And that supernatural creature is known as Floyd. Floyd is doing an experiment in a university someplace or a high school. It's not a high school, so let's say that creatures, if it's a high school, it's not Floyd, it's Trevor. So Trevor decides whether or not these things live or die and for how long. And they don't know it. They have no way of knowing it. They have no possible way of knowing it. But it's true, and we all know it's true. So, as below, so above. Which brings finally to the whole Christianity thing and the morality issue. If you can grant that a creature, or that a creature is not the word really, if you can grant, so, by the way, I remember reading Richard Dawkins and thinking, oh man, the guy's exactly right. Because when people say God created the universe, Dawkins says, okay, well, who created God? Where did God evolve from? How did God get there? And people say, well, he's always been there. Dawkins says, well, the universe has always been there, so there you go. The interesting thing about that is both the premises. Has God existed forever? What was before God? Well, what was before the Big Bang? What's the Big Bang expanding into? All of these questions are false questions. And when I say false, I don't mean that they're lies exactly. And I mean they're false to the degree that you cannot get to an answer for them because the question doesn't make any sense. When we say what was there before God, what was there before the universe, we are speaking about before and after. But these are concepts that just allow parameciums to go about their lives. There is no before and after. If I hold up a ruler and I ask you which part of the ruler is the most real, point the part of the ruler, point to the inch that's the most real. You'd say, don't be ridiculous. It's the ruler exists, and the 2-inch mark is no different than the 7-inch mark. They both equally exist, correct. But if you're sliding down that ruler from one end to another, you're going to say that the real part is the 4.5-inch mark because that's where you are right now. And later you'll be at the 5-inch mark and you'll say that's the reality, and so on and so on and so on. So anyway, all this to say that before and after doesn't exist. Before and after is a result of hominids trying to figure out how things work. It's a useful concept, before and after, but it doesn't explain things. And the more we get into the actual weeds of advanced physics, the more time begins to look like an illusion. It's a mental crutch, perceptual crutch. So here we are. I went to the Petri dish example because of this. What's going to determine whether or not those bacteria in Floyd's Petri dish live or die? Floyd's going to determine. And we all know that scientific experiments come to an end, and that when the experiments has run its course, they'll scoop out the stuff and seal it in a bag and throw that away, and those bacteria will die, and they'll put the Petri dish into something and sterilize it and use it again. So those bacteria are doomed. But they're only doomed because Floyd is not aware of them as individual creatures. And he's probably right in this on some level. But if you were to magnify our intelligence to the degree that our intelligence is larger than that of a bacteria, then you would, for all intents and purposes, be all-knowing. There is essentially your knowledge, your information base would be so huge we couldn't even conceive of it, in the same way that the bacteria can't conceive of it. So why would we be saved? In other words, why are we here, and why would we be saved? What would mean that we don't get thrown out with the rest of the garbage? Why are we here, and why do we stay here? And then you realize that Floyd is an ape. He's a primate. He's got killer instincts like every other primate, and he does all the primate things he needs to do. He poops and all the rest of it just in order to function as a body. He's a primate. But when you get right down to it, Floyd's a pretty good guy. And if Floyd was aware of the fact that every one of those little things down there had lives and individuality and stories and things like that, then Floyd wouldn't simply throw them in the garbage. He'd find a way to keep them going forever because he's a decent guy. And so the reason I think that if there is a larger observer, if there is a God, the reason that God loves us is because he can, and because he has to be. Because if he was evil, Eric, I know I don't want to interrupt this. I really don't, because I know you're a really good guy, but I have to tell you, there is a tendency of you to keep asking the same question again and again and again for the entire 2 hours. And every time I glance over there, it's really, really disruptive to me. So if I haven't told you whether or not I've seen Rio Bravo yet, then unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you today. So where does this go? If I could save bacteria that normally I wouldn't give a second thought to, if I could be made aware of the fact that these bacteria had lives, I would do everything in my power to save them. My wife is the same way. She is kind to animals. She doesn't have to be kind to animals. She's aggressively kind to animals. She goes looking for animals and feeds animals wherever she can. I'm the same way. And we're kind to animals because it's the right thing to do. Because it's the right thing to do. And I think that is it. So, to answer your question, Cheryl, having taken 25 minutes of our time or whatever, I believe that it's not only possible but likely that there is, in fact, a presence of not just of intelligence and power, but also of love, because we manage it and we have all of these defects built into us. I think to think that we're the most advanced creatures that have, not only that have lived, but who can possibly exist, to think that we are the most advanced creatures intellectually and morally that can possibly exist is arrogance of the highest order. My experience has been that the more intelligent people are and the more aware people are, the kinder they become. Certainly, even on the streets of America 100 years ago, you would see things you simply never could see today. People kicking dogs and spitting on, it's just inconceivable to us today. So, I think that puts God pretty much squarely in play, and which then leads to the other issue of, if you want to communicate with something that far below you, how do you do it? You cannot, going back to Floyd again, Floyd cannot just simply pull the cover off the petri dish and appear in the heavens above these creatures, because these creatures don't have eyes. They can't see him. What can he possibly do to influence them? What can he do to influence them? He could certainly change their environment, but if he wanted to change their behavior, if he wanted to change their perception on things, how could he do it? I suppose he could provide them with more food, but all that would do is just mean there'd be more of them and fatter ones. So what does he do? I would imagine if he was capable of it, he would reduce himself down to the size of these creatures and go and live among them as a means to do the very best way to influence them that you possibly can. And I'm just a, you know, I'm just a primate just recently down from the trees. But that's what I would do. So in answer to your question, I find myself thinking more and more, yes, this actually does make philosophical sense to me. And not only do I not see anything that prevents it scientifically, I see a number of things that scientifically argue for, at the very least, far more, infinitely more complex and mysterious world than the world that Richard Dawkins and Carl Sagan are defending. And I'm amazed at people who are that smart, that much smarter than me, weren't able to figure that out. So, yes, I do believe it. I do. I do believe that there is... I don't have any reason to believe it. I don't have an intellectual... let me rephrase it. I don't have direct evidence of it, but I have evidence of its possibility. I have the intellectual evidence of it being possible. That I clearly have. And I have the moral evidence of it being necessary. I have the moral evidence of it because I am morally obligated. Let me rephrase that. When I say morally obligated, it makes it sound like I'm morally obligated to some external choice. That's not what I mean to say. I personally choose, based on my character, to help animals that are hungry. If I see a hungry animal, I'll feed it. If I see a hungry person, I'll try and feed it. I'll do all of these things. Him, her. And if I can do it with all of the biological stains that we all carry, then none of this is a gigantic leap of faith for me. People say, when you die, will we see each other again? And I don't know the answer to that, needless to say. But I do feel constantly that the question is, again, a question that is limited by our perception. Will we see these people again in another life or in heaven? Again means after. But my understanding is there is no after. It's all simultaneously here. Those people and that relationship always exists. Good times and bad times. It's always existed. It will always exist. Nothing happens to it. It's a record. It's an LP. It's a piece of vinyl. That's what I believe. It's a piece of vinyl. And if I said to you on a 5-track side of a Frank Sinatra album, which part of this track is more real than the other parts, you would say the question's absurd. All you would be able to say is that the needle is in a certain place at a certain time, but one groove right next to the next groove, even though these things happen sequentially for us to perceive, that doesn't mean that the one groove is gone, disappears, and the upcoming groove doesn't exist. It's all there. And you can play it again and again and again and again and again. You can play it backwards if you want to. Again, forwards and backwards are also time-related issues. So it's pretty complex kind of thing. Some people are just born with faith, and I admire them enormously. I've always admired it. I've always found that the best people in my life had that faith. Starting with the hugely influential Phil Trick and other people like that, but Phil more than anybody. I remember in the days of the planetarium when I was really getting into this whole kind of materialistic, becoming that guy, becoming that Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan guy, that Phil was just a profoundly devout Christian and had it just solidly in his heart. And I admire him so much. And I thought and I still think he is so much smarter than me. Without question, he's a better person than me. There's no question about it. He is by far a better person than me, by far. And probably a smarter person too, although that boggles the mind if you're watching, Phil. And I know many people like that. I know many smart people, and I know many smart, good people, and a large percentage of the smart and good people believe this to be true. So I don't think I've gotten any smarter over my life, but I do know I've gotten better. I know I've gotten morally better than I was. It's beyond my ability to express. That from the person I was when I was 15, 16, 17, 20, 30, whatever, I am morally far superior to that person. I probably have about the same level of intellect, but my education is astonishingly better than it used to be. My repeated bouts with putting my head up against reality and having reality win every time have drummed some sense of wisdom into my thick skull. And all of that preceded getting married. And you want to talk about Big Bang expansion. I mean, the degree that I've morally grown and emotionally grown in the last, 14 months, 15 months since I met my wife is, I've grown more in the last 15 months than I had in the previous 57 years by a pretty wide margin, I would say. So, Cheryl, that's the answer to your question. The answer is yes, but with an asterisk. And the asterisk is that it is not something that I come to from faith the way that so many people do come to it and that I admire so much, but that I do not possess. But strangely enough, I end up in the same place as people with blind faith as a result of doing all of the investigating and looking for all of the scientific evidence I possibly can. That's probably a good way to end.